So this month, I will be doing something a little bit different. For the month of August, I am doing what I'm calling the Sharpening Your Axe Summer Series, nonprofit strategy sessions on sustainability. August is a great time to slow down, to go deep, to learn, to plan, and to prepare for the hustle of the end of the year. Just like Abraham Lincoln said, if you give me 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend 6 hours sharpening my axe. So my goal with this series is to help you sharpen your proverbial organizational axe during the slower, somewhat days of summer. Each week, I'll be focusing on one of the core elements that make nonprofits strong: fundraising, boards, staff, finance, and organizational direction. Each week, I'll be sharing content that explores the theme from different angles, a combination of short-form strategy tips, long-form trainings that go deeper into some aspect of the theme, and always an encore podcast episode featuring me in more of a generative conversation with one of my incredible guests, exploring the theme from yet a third angle. These strategy sessions are fire. So grab a notebook, grab a pen, curl up someplace really comfy, and enjoy. This week is week number 1, and we will be focusing on sharpening your fundraising axe. I've got a great interview with my girl, Jess Campbell. I'm pulling from my in-house library to share a 6-minute strategy episode about how to leverage the fundamentals of donor psychology. And I'm resharing an incredible audio masterclass with one of my very favorite people in the world and a fundraising guru, Susie Myers-Jackson. All of the resources mentioned and some that aren't are available in the show notes at brookerichiebabbage.com/podcast. Hi, thanks so much for tuning into the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast, where I do a deep dive into the strategies and mindset behind launching, growing, and leading a high-impact nonprofit. I'm your host, Brooke Richie-Babbage, and you're listening to episode number 22. Very rarely have I met someone as naturally gifted at resource generation as my friend Susie Myers-Jackson. I say resource generation rather than fundraising because what Susie has spent the past 18 years doing, first as the executive director of Opening Act here in New York City, and more recently as a strategic consultant and coach, has been more expansive than just raising money. Now, did she grow her organization from $25,000 to a multi-million-dollar institution? Yes. Did she perfect her Power of 10 campaign strategy to raise over $175,000 in 10 days through micro donations? Yes. Is she very good at fundraising? Yes. And I'm really excited that she shares concrete strategies for how to do this in this podcast. But I wanted to talk with her about something deeper, to go beyond the tactics of fundraising. Because at the core of her fundraising prowess is a true gift for thinking expansively about how to define and understand resources. She understands that relationships that she's building, the community that she's growing, that's the resource. And that's what she talks about in this podcast. And that understanding, that expansive definition of resources, has translated into money, time, investments, volunteers, raving supporters, advisors, partners, and ultimately transformative impact for the youth that she was working on behalf of at her organization. In this conversation with Susie, she breaks down her approach to resource generation, and she offers tactical advice and tools, real actionable steps that you can take to improve your own resource generation. She also provides insight into the way that she thinks about fundraising more deeply and how that is actually what has made her so effective. This is another great combination of strategy and mindset. I hope you enjoy. Susie, hi.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. I am, of course, particularly excited about this conversation. I've wanted to talk to you on this podcast for, well, the entire 6 months that I've been doing it. So this is great.
I'm honored.
Awesome. So I want to talk to you today about what I see as your true fundraising genius. I think that, so I don't say things I don't mean. So I mean that. I think so many people approach fundraising with fear, right? From a place of like, it's a battle to be won. They have to like fight it and win. And if they win, they get $1 million. But it's still at its core, something they have to push through. And what I've always appreciated, and I don't think I actually understood it this way until later in sort of watching you fundraise as a consultant and bringing the same like way of working that you brought to Opening Act to your consulting, I came to see how you fundraise as being sort of in a state of flow, right? Like you seem to work with the people who are your supporters and donors, and you have a way of really bringing them into your vision, into partnership. And it makes it seem, at least, like it is effortless. And because of that, I think you were able to do incredible things with the Opening Act budget in a really short period of time, right? And I've watched you do that same thing in really short periods of time, sort of transforming how organizations think about fundraising and approach fundraising with your clients. So that's what I am excited to talk about, sort of how you do this and how others who may be afraid of fundraising could learn from you and not see fundraising as something to be conquered. So let's dive in.
Great.
Were you always a fundraiser? How did you come to it? Was it easy for you? And I'm just going to say from the top of this conversation, don't be thrown off if I'm asking questions at some point that you're like, but you already know that. We've known each other for a decade. These are things that sometimes we've never talked about, in our friendship.
No, definitely not always a fundraiser. I started working at Opening Act and essentially came into working in the nonprofit sector when I was 23 and pretty much straight out of theater school. I have no degree in nonprofit management. I have no fundraising certificate. I was at Opening Act for almost 17 years. And so, certainly I feel like I did a lot of professional development in that time, lots of workshops but no formal classes. Yeah. So everything I learned about running a nonprofit, fundraising or not, came from talking to you, talking to peers, leaning on brilliant people on my team and failing, honestly, just messing up a lot and then learning. So no, I have not always been a fundraiser. I would say I have always been a connector to people, not necessarily and now sort of later in life, I feel like I am a connector of people. I'll hear you say something, I'm like, oh, you should meet my friend. Oh, you should, now that I have more people in my world to connect. But I think from if I think back even as a child, I always liked to connect with people and build relationships. And that, I imagine you'll end up hearing me say that over and over again in this conversation. To me, that is, if there's any secret to my fundraising success, it's genuinely connecting with people and building relationships with them. And I think I did learn how to be more, I don't know if strategic is the right word. I learned how that was useful in fundraising. And so then I was able to be more thoughtful about how I approached it. But I would say that's sort of how I started fundraising. And that's essentially the learning I came to fundraising with.
So I want to stay there for a minute because I think that every fundraising training I've ever gone to or done or been, the facilitator of, this idea of fundraising being rooted in relationships is like the core theme. Right? So everybody talks about, it's relationships. You build relationships. And I think I get that intellectually, right? I think I didn't become a good fundraiser until I understood what that meant at a more core level. So when you say it's about relationships, I feel like some people hear, well, I know lots of people, right? So now I just need to figure out the problem I have isn't that I don't have good relationships with people. It's that I don't know how to ask them for money. And so they're not realizing how relationships translate into strong fundraising. So when you say connecting with people, building relationships, and that was the secret of success of your fundraising, what's the link?
It's understanding the person's why. So it's actually, it's not about knowing people. It's about listening to people. Yeah. And it's not about walking into, some networking cocktail party or some lunch with a potential funder and having the most amazing pitch.
Right.
It's about, so you talked about fear. So in improv, there's this phrase, sort of a tenet of improv called face the fear.
Oh, that sounds like an activity I would never want to do.
I think honestly, and I do think sort of growing up in, doing theater is probably why I'm successful at fundraising, because I'm accustomed to going on stage with a bunch of people looking at me and having rehearsed, but also having learned to be willing to let all of the rehearsal go, step onto the stage and listen to my scene partner.
Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially what I do. If I picture, okay, I'm going into a pitch meeting, a lunch with a donor.
I hate that they call them pitches because it sets you up on sort of opposite sides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I certainly think about it before I go in. I'm not improvising the meeting, right? I think in advance about what are the key points that I want to make about where we're headed as an organization, about what our strategic plan is, about why we need support, et cetera. But if we imagine that going into that meeting, I don't actually know this person, this potential funder, then I have that rehearsal in the back of my mind. I know the things that I bring to the table, but I'm really approaching this conversation to listen and find out what they bring to the table. Why are they even at the table? So for me, I talk a lot about like a Venn diagram where circles overlap. Mm-hmm. So when I think about a potential supporter of an organization, whether it's an institutional supporter or an individual, I try to really like get in their head and understand their why. If it's an individual, I ask questions. If it's a funder who won't take calls, I really dig into their website. But I try and understand this person, this institution sitting across from me. Why are they here? What do they want? What are the really unique strengths and assets that they bring to this table, to this work? And then I think about what do we need so that we can achieve our mission? And then I say, what's the sweet spot where those two things overlap?
That's how you bring them in. Because actually you're sitting in the same space together. It's not, I need this, I need this. It's, here's a place where actually we are saying we have the same North Star.
Exactly. We want the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of things, like I used to talk a lot about opening act and fundraising and say, it's like you have a deck of 52 cards. If you're pitching opening act to something, you have a deck of 52 cards, and each card is an authentic reason that someone might want to get involved in our organization. It might be that they care about theater. It might be that they care about New York City schools. It might be that they care about youth development. All these different cards, and they are all real, authentic reasons. But not every card matters to every person.
Yeah.
So if I'm in a conversation with someone who like really doesn't care about theater, like I talk about this sometimes, like knowing what I call them sneaky questions, but now I don't even want to call them sneaky because it sounds negative. Just like, what are your learning questions that can help you quickly understand why someone might be interested in your work?
Generative questions. They're generative. Yeah.
So one of the ones with opening acts that I would often ask is like, what was your thing in high school? Like what got you through being a teenager? Because being a teenager is hard, period, no matter where you are. Wow. And if someone would say football, then I would say, why? Tell me about it. They'd be like, well, being a teenager was hard. Maybe things weren't going well with my family or whatever it was. But, football, I felt like I was a part of something. I felt like I had a team. The coach really saw me as a human being. And then I'd be like, yeah, so that was theater for me. And that's what we do at opening act. And it doesn't matter to me but if I had laid the card, if I hadn't listened, if I had laid the card down at the top and I led with, we're a theater organization, this is what we do. And again, I learned this by doing and failing and watching people's eyes glaze over because that's not where their circle overlaps with mine.
Yeah.
And so then they're immediately like, oh, I'm not, I glaze out. This isn't my thing.
Yeah.
And it's not about being sneaky. It's not about trying to convince someone that theater is the exact same as football. Yeah. But if I really understand their why and how they might connect to this work. And then I can assess, to be honest, there have been times where I've met with donors and if I don't feel like there's a true overlap.
I was going to ask, yeah.
Yeah, you should actually look into STEM from Dance.
Yeah.
I would love to have you support opening acts, but I think this is where your North Star overlaps with another organization. That's okay. And I think that's part of the thing that, it is, you have sort of embedded in my brain this idea of an abundance mindset. And I struggle with it. Don't get me wrong. But here's the thing I will say. It's very rare that I've felt like I should do that or needed to do that, send someone to another organization, because for me, at least at opening act, because there were legitimately 52 cards that I understood and believed in, it was almost impossible to not find a person who could connect with what we were doing.
Yeah. Empowerment, being part of a community. Yeah.
I mean, so it was very, very rare.
It's so interesting, this listening, like I'm just putting myself back into the mind, my sort of fundraising mind early in building my organization. You know, when I was a baby founder and a baby ED, that was the hardest thing for me. Like, I think I'm a pretty good listener. I really enjoy people's stories. But I started my organization because I believed very strongly in a particular vision of change, right? A vision of the world and a theory of change, right? There were strategies that I believed in to get the young people that we worked with to a particular place. And I think it took me years, probably 2 or 3 years before I came to understand two things that I hear you saying. One, I would go into conversations with funders and donors and be really excited to tell them my vision. Mm-hmm. Which ironically, when you're a founder, that's what people tell you to do. But that's a lot. That is the pitch. That's here's what my thing is. And if someone's eyes glazed over, I was like, oh, guess they're not a fit. Right. And I'd sort of feel bad and move on to the next person. And then it got scary because I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to go in and there's some chance that this person's eyes are going to glaze over or whatever the sort of version of no is. And it took me years to realize, oh, it's because I'm so interested in my thing in getting them to agree with me that I'm not actually asking, why did they even sit down with me? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the second thing that I realized that I hear you saying is, and I want to ask you how this showed up for you, even when I learned to listen, which transformed my fundraising, I still failed sometimes. Right. And I don't want to frame it that way. Abundance mindset. Not everybody was the right donor. Uh-huh. And I had a really hard time separating out. So I did all the things. I listened. I have these 52 cards. I think it's really hard not to find some way to connect with people. And I still had people say no. Mm-hmm. And I could internalize that as I didn't pitch right. I didn't listen right. Like, talk to me about how you still didn't get donor sometimes. Was it always just because you sent them somewhere else? Or were there times when you went for something and you were just like, oh, I didn't close that? And why?
So I just want to say one sort of caveat to what I said earlier, this idea that I would like send them elsewhere. To be honest, that probably only happened once. However, I think this idea of how I approach the conversation as opposed to trying to conquer it, like gripping it,
right,
was that, I don't know, this is hard to articulate. It didn't feel like something to be conquered. And then I either grabbed them for myself or sent them to someone else. Mm-hmm. The other thing I will say, and you mentioned kind of at the beginning of this conversation, like that I've been successful at fundraising in short amounts of time. I don't know if that's true. I mean, that might be relatively true, but I actually think one of the biggest lessons for me is to have patience with donors. Mm-hmm. It takes time. Yeah. It takes time. And I've had to like coach board members on this too, because they'll sort of get frustrated that they, have a person in their network that they're kind of working on. Why haven't they given yet? Why haven't they given more? There was one fundraising lesson that I had. There was a donor, an individual who was a friend of a board member, like longtime family friend. And they had given to Opening Act every year for probably since this board member asked her to give. It had probably been 5 years at that point. And she wrote a check, which was a significant check for Opening Act. We were small, but not sort of a massive check, we'll say that. And she gave every year for 5 years. And she would come to the events and she would respond to the emails. And then about 5 years in, this board member invited the donor to go to one of our schools. And honestly, she probably invited her to go before, but she went this time. And they took like a train and 2 buses. So from, Upper West Side to East Flatbush. And they did a site visit. I wasn't there with them. We didn't even call it a site visit. Like we were so, I don't think I can use that term. They went to see a program. And in my eyes, I wouldn't even consider it a particularly successful program visit. I think 2 kids showed up for the program that day.
Oh, that was always like a gut punch.
Yeah. They're like one of the teaching artists had to call in sick last minute. It was a tough day. Yeah. But that day, I think the next day, the donor wrote a check for 10 times what they had been giving every year up until that point.
Yeah.
And it taught me two things. One, you got to get people into the program because when they see the work, it is so different to see it and be there than to hear about it or be in an event. Two, it takes time.
Yeah.
I don't know that she would have written that check 5 years ago. Like there was a cultivation of her. Again, we didn't call it that at the time. I was too ignorant of these sort of fundraising terms then. And maybe that's part of the success, right? I wasn't thinking about it.
Thinking maybe we need to not think about it's cultivating. It's just building a relationship.
It's building a relationship. Like I never use the phrase steward a donor. I get it now. I hear myself using it as I talk to other nonprofit people because people know that phrase. But I think it is just having touch points over the course of however much time, years. I like using the phrase more like moving them along a continuum of engagement.
Yeah.
Like how do you start with a casual conversation that introduces them to the work and then move on to maybe they attend an event or something and then have them come visit a program? Like how are you moving their engagement along as opposed to increasing their check every year? Because those things happen together. But I think you can either approach it of how am I getting more money out of this person?
Which is transactional.
Or you can think, how can I deepen this person's relationship?
Which is relational. Yeah. I want to highlight something and then I want to ask about one of your amazing strategies that you taught me. So the thing I want to highlight is one of the very first, and you probably remember this because I feel like I've referenced this multiple times. One of the very first conversations you and I had was not the one when I asked you for your maternity leave plan, which changed my life. It was when we first met, Catalog for Giving or Spark Youth. And you said something in one of the group meetings about cultivation, or I don't remember what you said that triggered, I bet she has some ideas about cultivating donors. So I invited you to coffee and we sat down and you showed up with this huge ass binder. I mean, it feels in my memory like it was like a 5-inch binder, like one of those like legal binders, you know?
It was not. It was a 1-inch binder.
I remember a blue 5-inch binder. That's what happened in my memory. But what was amazing to me was you sat down and you had this sheet that folded out and it was a visual like map of the flow that different donors could go through. I mean, it's like, well, if they came to a program, here are 4 different things they may be interested in. You know, we have events every other month. Like there was a calendar. So I highlight that because I started off talking about how you sort of go with in the flow of fundraising, but I don't want to suggest to anyone listening that it just sort of happens and conversations with people and then checks. You were so deeply intentional about and thoughtful about if I take all 52 cards, how do I connect them to one another? Where is this donor coming into our world? And what is going to be the most wonderful and exciting journey for them through the world? And the document you showed me mapped it out so that everyone on your team got the journey. I had been fundraising probably at that point for 5 years. I'd never seen anything like that. So I just wanted to lift that up because I do think our conversation, you are a natural at this and you took time. And you were intentional and very thoughtful about it. And that's what in my parlance, I call it being strategic. But I think that makes people, again, think it's like adversarial and sneaky. It's just thoughtful and intentional.
Yeah. And I think if you can have both, it's like doing all the rehearsal and then showing up and just being in the moment.
Yeah.
That is the sweet spot for the fundraiser. Yeah. So that document, I think we called that our cultivation flow chart.
Fantastic.
And it came out of when our board, I feel like boards, you kind of go in waves in terms of the function of a board in organizations. You have the sort of founding board, which is like they sign the paper so you can get your 501c3. You move into a working board because you have no staff. So they're literally like your team members. Then it was when we started to shift into, okay, now we actually have a couple staff members. And we need the board to be thinking more strategically, about governance things, but also about fundraising. And board members naturally I don't know if it's naturally, but they were afraid of fundraising. Most people are afraid of fundraising. And so what I really tried to do is I always say like flip the switch in their brains so that instead of it feeling like, because I feel like people either are afraid of it or they sort of enter it, I think, like you said, like with this conquering motivation, which often results in what I call like bullying people into donating or guilting people into donating. Yeah. And I feel like that can work for a one-time gift, but that's not you're not developing a relationship with someone who will be a long-term supporter of the organization if they're only giving because you're making them feel guilty, or you say, you know, I bought a table at your event, so you have to buy a table at my event. So we wanted to give people tools to help shift them out of that mindset. So we created this cultivation flowchart because, like you said, you know, a board member say, well, I have this person, I feel like she would be interested, but I don't know what to do. Like, here's what you do. And it started with, there were two things on that flowchart. One was a calendar.
Yep.
The year. We said, how are we connecting people to the work? And the part that could have been sort of ad hoc is like, well, you can always take them to a program. But I think two things. One, that was difficult because of the time of day that it happened, where it happened. It was hard to get people who maybe were working in Manhattan to a school deep into Brooklyn or the Bronx on Tuesday afternoon at 3:00. So we said, okay, we know that that's there, but how can we create a calendar of opportunities that, I remember the board sort of charged me with, they said, at any point that I meet someone, I want to be able to invite them to something within 6 weeks.
Yep. You taught me that. That became our rule. Yeah.
Because what was happening for us was, sure, we could take them to a program visit, and then we had the end of year student performances, which were a great thing for people to come see. But if you met someone in October and told them about opening acts, you'd say, you should come see the students perform at the end of May. That was like all we had.
Yeah.
And so I will say, I think we sort of swung the pendulum too far. Then we planned so many events that it became really overwhelming for the staff. And then we sort of did the next wave of strategy or intentionality, where we stopped thinking about one-off events throughout the year. And we thought about how are all of those things connected and a trajectory. And I think you're going to ask me about the Power of 10. So when we get there, I'll explain how that fit in. But
next.
We started to think, so these touch points, they didn't necessarily have to be huge events. We started really simply by just really casual, you know, invite 10, 15 friends over, have a teaching artist there who could speak about the work. And that was it. Like nothing, whoever was hosting it, it's not like it was a catered event or anything. It was just a board member saying, hey, you've heard me talk about, I'm on the board. I'm going to have, 10, 15 friends over, and Susie or Marcus or, a teaching artist is coming to talk about the work. Come over. I'm going to have some cheese and some dessert.
And those weren't ask events.
Sometimes they were, but eventually we moved away. When we got to like the second wave of intentionality around the calendar, then I think we got more specificity about this is cultivation, ask.
Yep.
And then recognition.
Yeah.
We would have an event that was purely thank you.
Yeah.
So we got more intentional, thoughtful, strategic, whatever word you want to use, as we went on. At the beginning, I think there was, and if you want to donate, but it was not a very well executed ask. Yeah. But what it did start to do, those little events, was it started to build up the community of people that knew about what we were doing.
Yeah. That is a great lead in to Power of 10.
Yeah.
So do you want to say just briefly, what is the Power of 10 model? And then actually, I want to start with what's the most successful year that you had with the Power of 10? And then let's talk about how it's rooted in relationships, because I think everything you've been talking about, that model just is a great example.
Yeah.
Fundraising.
So Power of 10 now is, I feel like everyone knows the type of model. It's a, micro donation campaign, primarily driven sort of online and through what we call team leaders. But you get a bunch of people to say, I'll fundraise from my friends, and then we're all adding up to this goal. When we first did it in 2010, it was very much sort of taking a page out of the Obama 2008 election playbook. And it did feel new within sort of nonprofit, but definitely within our smaller community of sort of New York, small to medium-sized nonprofits. It was, people weren't doing it then. So it did feel more innovative then than perhaps it does now. But this really simple idea, our then program director, Gina Grandi, and I came up with at this fundraising workshop that we had gone to, where they were saying, it was like this new idea of raising money online.
No,
funny to say now.
Crazy.
Brainstorm about how you might actually raise money online.
Work. Yeah.
And so it was 2010. It was our 10th anniversary. We were hoping to start our 10th program. And so we came up with this idea of raising $10,000 in 10 days through $10 donations to open our 10th school in 2010. So it was a lot of tens. So that was the basic idea. And even in that first year, the goal was $10,000 and we raised, I believe, $25,000.
Yeah. The first year you taught me, our goal was 10,000, right? 10, I think it's ask 10 people, that's 10 of their friends, that's 10 of their friends for $10 to get to 10,000. And our goal was 10,000. And I think we raised 19 in 10 days. Yeah. And I remember being like, what is this magic that Susie just taught me?
Yeah. I think our most successful year when I was there, we ended up raising about $175,000.
Yeah, I couldn't remember the number, but I wanted to make sure we got it in the podcast.
Yeah, out of a $2 million budget. So, I mean, that's almost 10% of our budget. That's, it's a solid chunk. But more than that, which I think you're going to get to, it wasn't just about the dollar amount. It was about how we actually used that campaign to deepen relationships with people.
So talk about that. I mean, because what I was going to say is, and it didn't dawn on me until I started thinking about this conversation we're going to have, that model is rooted in relationships. It's all about relationships. And so, what I know about you, that's not surprising. But talk about how you used it, right? It's micro donation. So it's small donation. So it's not just about the fundraising. How is it a relationship building tool?
So there's sort of two groups of people that you're building relationships with. The first group of people is, again, what I called our team leaders, but they are essentially your fundraisers. They're the people who say, okay, I will ask my friends for money.
Right. We call them our ambassadors. Yeah.
And the way that first year and really every year thereafter, we would think about who do we want to invite to be a team leader? We'd say, I always use the term key stakeholders, like who are our key stakeholders? And to me, that's anyone who's critical to us being able to do our work. So we would make lists of those people, teaching artists, parents, alums, board members, artistic advisory board members, longtime donors, whoever. Would get this huge list. And then I'd sort of cull it down and think about the people that, based on sort of where I was in terms of building their relationship to opening act, who did I feel comfortable making this ask of at this point in time? Because some people, like if they were really sort of early on in that trajectory, I maybe didn't want to jump the gun and say, will you fundraise? When they're like, I just learned about this organization. Yeah. But then once we would get that list, then everything else was about, okay, how are we really building relationships with these, deepening relationships with these people? This is very rare that we would do a cold ask to be a Power of 10 leader. How are we building relationships with them along the way? And the first thing is, how are you asking them to be a leader? It's a big deal to ask someone to fundraise for you. I mean, this is the whole topic of the conversation, that fundraising is scary. So if you're going to go and ask someone, if you're going to ask someone not just to give you money, but to fundraise on your behalf, that's a big ask.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity for them to make a huge impact. So it's an exciting ask. Mm-hmm. So I think one of my biggest lessons about relationship building and fundraising is you have to invest the time up front. So, especially within our Sustainable Sisterhood group, once the Power of 10, it got out there, everyone was, Susie, sit down and tell me how to do this. Yeah. I will say there were times that I would sort of share the tools with another ED, and then it wasn't successful for them.
Right.
And I would say the biggest two things, if I say two factors that made it not successful for someone. One was if they just didn't have enough of a community to start with, of people to go to. If they only had 10 people to ask to be, it's hard. It's a numbers game. But the main thing was when EDs, and I totally understand why, because of a lack of time, but when they sort of took a shortcut at the top and said, you know what, I'm just going to send an email and BCC everyone and ask them to be team leaders. Yeah. Or I'm just going to send an email that's the same email to everyone.
Yeah.
Didn't work. People didn't say yes.
It's just tactical. Yeah.
So that initial, and when we started to have a bigger team at Opening Act, my role in Power of 10 remained making those asks. So the sort of month before Power of 10, which is when we were lining up team leaders, was the biggest investment of time for me in the campaign. And those early years, I called people, I sent very personal emails. I requested a 15-minute call. I would get on the phone and so usually by that point, if I considered them a key stakeholder, I knew their why.
I was going to say, how did you get them? Yeah.
Yeah. So if I knew their why, I would connect our why of that campaign to theirs.
Right.
So I would say, Brooke, look, you have been supporting Opening Act as my friend, for the last 5 years, right? And I know you donate to a lot of places and you probably just give it to Opening Act because you know me, but you also know that this is a key moment in Opening Act's trajectory as a nonprofit, whatever it is, it's our 20th anniversary, it's our whatever the thing is. And so I am inviting you to take this impact, this strong impact, powerful impact you've had on the organization with your own dollars and just like amplify it to the 10th degree. It's a really small ask that I'm going to ask you to make of your friends. I'm going to give you every tool you need to make it super, super easy. We're going to have a party at the end, whatever the things were.
And you literally gave them the emails to send, gave them the social media to post, and they are asking their friends for $10. So like that's where the micro donation is really, really powerful. Yeah.
So I think, but taking the time it's like getting someone into the program. It's a lot harder for someone to say no to you when you're face to face with them or on the phone and you connect your why to their why. It's way easier to say no or to just not respond to an email, and definitely to an email where you have no idea how many other people are BCC'd.
Right.
And what we would do then to be strategic about our time is I would invest all that time up front, get people to say yes. And then look, some years we had 120 team leaders. I couldn't send them a personal email every single time, but we would be thoughtful about the mix of emails that were 120 people BCC'd and saying, hey, team leaders. And even then we tried to use that as an opportunity to create a sense of community for them with these other people. We weren't trying to hide that it was BCC'd,
As a micro.
And maybe once during the campaign, I would personally email people, and eventually it was someone on our development, our director of development or development coordinator was doing those emails, but mixing that up so that people really not just felt, but were very thoughtfully and genuinely invited in.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I want to just highlight and go back to, so when I first did the Power of 10, I don't remember what my first theme was. It wasn't called the Power of 10 because that was your theme. But when I did the model, I had 3 people on my staff, including, me, 2 full-time and a part-time. So very small staff. I had 7 people on my board and only 5 of them actually did it, right? I think I had a total fundraising team of like 16 people. It was very, very small. And that was the year that we made $18,000. So I want to highlight that because I think it's, that's nothing compared to where we got to 6 years later. But even with a small team, it can work. I think that second thing you highlighted is the key, right? It's like if you only have 10 people, if it's just you and your board, if it's just you, your part-time staff and your teaching artists, like you can still do it, but that upfront part is going to be even more important.
Yeah. I mean, the first year we did it, when it was Gina and I, we were the only staff members. And I think she was part-time. We had 1.75 staff members. And our board was probably about 7 people as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as we went along, as we had more capacity to do more, we sometimes did, like we would do more videos or we would do sort of higher production value videos. But then ultimately we ended up, again, I think we sort of then swung the pendulum too far. And then we ended up coming back and saying, we need to simplify, not just for our sake, but for our people's sake.
Yeah, that's right. So the last question I want to ask you before we wrap up is about your board. We talked a little bit about them earlier, but you had a really great fundraising relationship with your board, both in terms of how they personally gave and sort of how the board structured their fundraising relationship to the organization as individuals. I loved working with you guys, and really, I think I was there for a conversation you had about how to think about the give get. And it was just this amazing conversation to watch from a governance perspective. But I want to ask you a really pointed question. I get this a lot with the folks that I work with. What did you say to your board to get them to fundraise? Right? We talked a little bit about the cultivation sort of calendar. And I'm sort of saying it with a smile because obviously there wasn't just like a catchphrase that you used, but it feels a little bit like you had a unicorn board, right? Like people always talk about these mythical boards that give and also ask their friends and get big checks. And there can be an instinct that organizational leaders have when they look at their board and they're like, I'm just so far away. Like, I just can't even contemplate that being my board. That must be a magical board, right? Like that's those people. that's not my organization. What was at the root of that? Because it isn't, I mean, I've met your board. They're amazing people, but they're not unicorns. They're not magical humans that like just happen to find opening acts. They're normal people.
Well, I mean, like all of this, it's not one magical phrase that I said.
That's too bad, because then, you'd be a billionaire.
It does take time. I think the first thing, if I go back to when I was talking about those waves of boards, the first thing, honestly, is getting to a place where the board has to believe that part of their role is fundraising.
Yeah.
So if they don't, I mean, then you're stuck.
You're not going to trick them into it. Yeah.
No. So I think the ways that you can go about that, and this is ultimately what ended up happening with ours, it's usually best that they hear that from someone who isn't the ED, like that the role of a board, part of the role of a board is to fundraise. And sometimes that doesn't have to be the role early on in the organization, but most organizations come to a point where the organization can't survive if the board is not fundraising. So if I was like talking to an ED who says, I don't know how to get that, I would say, pay a consultant, even if it's just for 2 hours to come to one board meeting. Hire you, Brooke, hire me, have someone else come in and talk to your board. They need to hear it from someone else. And you've got to create buy-in, even if the board member themselves may start to see that that's not the right fit for them anymore. Mm-hmm. But until the board as a whole can acknowledge for this organization to survive, to thrive, the board has to engage in fundraising. That's step one. And either once they acknowledge that might mean that then you move on to step two, which I'll get to in a moment. Or they might acknowledge that. And some folks may say, then you know what, this isn't the right place for me anymore. And you have to be okay with that, because if you as an ED are like, I need my board to fundraise, and you have people who are never going to fundraise, figure out where their circle overlaps with your circle and how they can fulfill some other need in the organization. It doesn't mean that you end the relationship. They don't even have to feel bad about it. Yep. That said, move on to step two, which is, so once you have people understand that it's part of their role, then you have to give them the tools to do it.
Yeah.
You can't, look, we're talking now with people who part of their job description is fundraising, and they're scared of fundraising. It makes sense. You can't expect your board, they aren't magical unicorns. People have tons of baggage around money and asking people for money. So you can't expect that they can just magically do it. And what I will say is, oftentimes, what I would encourage, let's say you get to this point, the board acknowledges, okay, we know that we have to fundraise, but half of us feel like, then I'm out because I can't fundraise. Just say, maybe you can say to them, give me 3 months. Mm-hmm. Let me teach you. Let me give you some tools. And then decide if those tools make it actually an obstacle you can overcome, that you can get past the fear and you can do it. And if not, and if you really just are like, that is not something I want to do, then that's okay. Then let's find another place where your North Star aligns with the organizations and you can still be involved. But you've got to get them to a place where they acknowledge it as part of their role, and then building tools with them. And that's probably a whole other podcast conversation about how you build tools. But I would say it's a combination, like we said, of that flow chart of sort of mindset, having people start to shift their mindset away from the bullying or the fear or the guilting and into I, as a board member, am passionate and inspired by this work. And by asking my friends, by bringing my friends in, I am giving them an opportunity to be a part of something so inspiring and wonderful in my life that it can enrich theirs in the same way. So getting them there and then giving them like the calendar and the tools and the email templates and everything to make it so easy.
The 52 cards. I love it.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, what words of advice do you have for my listeners, most of whom are small to medium-sized organizations under $2 or $3 million, building the bones, right, of a strong organization? What would you say about fundraising for them? It can only be one thing, and it has to be amazing. So take a moment.
My first advice is just what I just did for myself, which is take a big breath. Take a big breath. I think my second piece of advice is to build your community, to build your, I often thought of, as I was building opening act, of being these, what do we call circles that go out like this?
Concentric.
Those are concentric.
Yeah.
Study math. Okay. like this ripple effect, and you can't get to that big circle right away. That takes time. And whatever that big circle is for you, whether it's crossing the $1 million mark or having donors who are capable of writing $50,000 checks or whatever it is, you can't get there right away. So just start with that little circle. And that little circle might be your board. It might be your peers. Start with that circle and start by listening. One of the great pieces of advice I was given is when I was sort of thinking about how do we really take it to the next level in terms of fundraising? Look at who's giving to your organization right now. Get your top, whoever you consider like your top 5 to 10 donors, ask them for a 20-minute call and just listen. Say, why did you write your first check to Opening Act?
Yeah.
Why did you write that first check? Why are you still here? And you're going to start to understand. It was by listening that I developed those 52 cards. I didn't sit in a room by myself and map out my 52 cards. Right. I needed to know what other people's were.
Right.
So give yourself a little time that is, I would call like a listening campaign. Doesn't have to be big. It could be 3 people.
Yeah.
And just call and say, why did you give to this organization? Why do you continue to give? What would make you want to give more? And start to really see those people as trusted partners in the work.
I always love talking to you. I'm like, my mind is just like spinning with things to talk to. I'm like, oh, right. I have to call this client and say these words because she's been like, struggling with this. This was just a fantastic conversation. Exactly what I had hoped. You really are just very, very good at what you do. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
And have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks so much for joining me this week. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on Apple or wherever you listen to your podcasts and definitely share with your friends. That's all for now. Have a great week, and I'll see you back here next week for more Mastermind.